Hey, so welcome back to another episode of Sten Reacts. Mike Stenhouse here, reminding you, I'm in the bourbon bar and reminding you that there's nothing like a charred oak tumbler to sip your favorite whiskey. All right. Earlier this week, we're in the week here of July 20th, the Governor McKee's office put out this release on a statement on this month's job numbers, which saw the unemployment rate drop to 2.9%, and that they're bragging that this low unemployment rate is the 19th consecutive month that our state's unemployment rate has been below the national unemployment rate. But I'm going to ask this question. Despite that news, which is intriguing, and we'll talk about that, is Rhode Island in a death spiral, an economic death spiral? All right. So I want you to let me describe what a death spiral is. And then as we go through the Len Lodaro report, the URI economics professor who believes we're entering a recession, I'm saying we're entering death spiral mode. Keep these thoughts in mind when we go through his report. First of all, what is a death spiral? And the way I use it, a death spiral is a lower and lower tax base, which means fewer people with less wealth able to pay taxes and support all of the excessive spending that goes on in this base in the state. So you got ever decreasing tax base with an ever increasing spending problem by the state. And what does that do? Well, when you put more burden on fewer people, those few people, when they're free to travel and move like they are in America, those fewer people are likely to flee the state. And we know that Rhode Island has a population problem. We're not for shenanigans by former Governor Gina Raimondo, now Commerce Secretary, whose department runs the United States Census. We're not for convenient miscalculations in the 2020 census. Rhode Island's stagnant population growth, zero growth, it's basically stayed the same for decades now, but the rest of the country is growing. That lack of growth should have cost us a second U.S. House congressional seat. But Gina Raimondo somehow conveniently added Rhode Island to one of the few states that was overcounted, whose population was overcounted, and was awarded a congressional seat they didn't deserve. So keep all that in mind, the death spiral and its effect on populations. All right, so the governor, again, touted great economic news in the jobs numbers, but the jobs numbers do not tell the whole story. I want to share with you now the current conditions index report by Professor Leonard Lodaro. He's down at the University of Rhode Island, and he says here. So I'm reacting. This is really. I mean, I skimmed his summary, but I'm going to be reacting with you to his report. He's saying Rhode Island's economy is now at a point. And let me just make it bigger so you can see it. Here we go. Is now at a point where it's difficult to discuss whether or not it's in a recession. Now, let me say this. You don't have to be in a recession to be in a death spiral. All right. It's already started. Fewer and fewer people able to shoulder the burden of increasing, and ever increasing state spending costs. Okay, that's what it is. All right, so Lodaro goes on to continue to say that low numbers, a downward trajectory in Rhode Island's economy since the end of last year, while most of the country is still recovering. And remember, Lodaro talks about Rhode Island has this habit of being the first in and the last out of economic downturns or recessions. And Lodaro is openly wondering right now if Rhode Island is now going to be once again the first into not only our own state's recession, but what could be a national recession that many people believe as well. So is history repeating itself again? He's saying that retail sales and manufacturing hours, as well as employment service jobs, and new claims, all are negative signs. The labor force still has not strengthened yet, as he shows here, and permits for new construction in homes, one of the key economic indicators for new home construction, are also down. Lodaro says this really could be a big problem. He says in aggregate, he goes while certain jobs numbers might be misleading, he goes on to explain that, which we'll get into here in a second. So let's go back up. So he concludes that based on aggregate numbers, despite the low unemployment rate and the adjusted now he goes on to explain here the adjusted unemployment rate, as we've described many times on this show. The unemployment rate is a bit of an illusion, because if not a lot of people are looking for jobs, in other words, if you have a low labor force, a lowering labor force, that tends to lower. That's a bad thing. When not a lot of people are incentivized to look for work or are producing output or producing taxable revenues, that's bad for the state. But yet, when that labor force participation rate goes down, it also lowers the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate is a deceptive figure. Lodaro shows here something he calls an adjusted unemployment rate that takes into account that conflict between labor force participation and unemployment. And he says that our adjusted rate should be above 5% unemployment. Lodaro says we're not technically in a recession yet, because not all the factors are pointing red, but he says we are in a statistical recession. He says we can basically say we're right on the doorstep, and all the factors are many of the factors are pointing down, even though a few of the factors are pointing up. And what are some of those factors that are pointing up? Well, the unemployment rate is low, even though we have a low labor force participation rate, and even though the number of Rhode Island-based jobs is lower than the number of Rhode Islanders who are working out of state. I'll show you that chart in a second. But the low unemployment rate combined with high levels of savings are the only reason Lodaro says we're not officially in a recession. And he says the reason we have those is because of the artificial stimulus put forth by the federal government in all of its various COVID relief funds. They've put a lot of money into a lot of people's pockets. They've incentivized a lot of employers to keep a lot of people employed when otherwise they might have laid them off during the pandemic or after the pandemic. But those funds are not going to be renewed. So people's savings are going to start going down, and incentives to keep people hired. If the business can't support it on its own, there's not going to be any more federal incentives to support that. So that's his caution. All right. Does that make sense to you? All right. What do we have here? We have here, let's see, okay. So here we have let me show you this chart. We show the labor. Well, here's his index. You can see his index reached a high last year in 2022. And it's been pretty much going down since. Here's a neutral index. It's been negative. Lodaro's index has been negative, been going down, in most of the last 4 to 5 months. Not a good sign for Rhode Island. The labor force, here's some charts he shows. We won't show this, but this is the one. This is a real concerning chart right here. In the last 6 months, or last 4 months, we've actually had negative resident employment, which means the number of Rhode Islanders working went down, including May. Now they went up slightly in the governor's report in June. So this resident employment is going to be back slightly above zero, but the trend is still downward. Remember, there's a difference in the statistic between a Rhode Islander who is working, whether that's in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, or somewhere else, and jobs that are based in Rhode Island-based companies. That's payroll employment, and even payroll employment has been going down the last few months, but resident employment has been significantly trending downward, even though we got a slight tick up in June per the report that just came out today. So really, again, I just want to circle back to the death spiral. Now, when we're having the one thing that might have been keeping people in Rhode Island, despite the high cost of living and the increasing burden on those of us that are left, is the fact that there's been plentiful jobs. But if that job trend continues down, even though the unemployment rate looks, again, sometimes looks are deceiving, even though the unemployment rate looks like it's solid, most of the other economic factors, except for personal savings, according to Len Ladaro, though you're right, Professor, are pointing down. So, just to wrap it all up, if you add to the fact high taxes, high cost of living, high burden for taxes and fees placed on fewer and fewer Rhode Islanders who are able to shoulder that burden, that's going to drive more and more families, graduates, business owners, potential investors to look elsewhere, to look into other states, potentially and likely even moving. Add to that a loss of jobs, which we could be on the horizon of seeing, and the death spiral, and more people will flee Rhode Island, meaning even fewer productive people who are able to shoulder these increasing burdens will be able to withstand the high cost of living here in Rhode Island. So that's my reaction to Rhode Island's economic report for the month of May and June. And we'll, of course, be talking about that more on In the Dugout. So for In the Bourbon Bar and for Sten Reacts, Mike Stenhouse, wishing you a happy summer. Remember to drink responsibly, but if you're going to do whiskey, do it in a charred oak tumbler. And also a reminder that all of my Sten Reacts episodes can be found at the top of oceanstatecurrent.com. Just click the watch menu item and pick Sten Reacts from the options there. So we'll see you next time back in the Bourbon Bar.